Hello and welcome back to another Josh Plays 40k painting tutorial. Today I will be painting a Hive Fleet Leviathan Tyranid warrior, fitted out with a bone sword, lash whip and a death spitter. Now these models are really customizable when it comes to the loadout options. You can have them loaded with guns and melee weapons, you can have them just with melee weapons, you can have them with guns and smaller melee weapons. There's really quite a lot of options in the box, but the technique sort of shown on here with regards to the colours and how the weapons are base coated, then we'll be able to obviously transfer that onto the other weapons in the box. So without further ado, we'll grab some brushes and get started. So if you're familiar with some of my Tyranid tutorials before, you'll know that the first thing I always do is I undercoat the model with Corax White, and then I put a base coat layer of Screaming Skull over the top. This obviously just helps start the skin tones off. Now I do use an airbrush for this, but you can use a brush and just paint it on normally if you prefer. I use the airbrush just simply to save time. But once you've got that base coat applied, the first thing we're going to do is start layering over the purple carapace and armour parts of the model. This is so that if we do make any mistakes, because this is obviously quite a dark colour, we can touch back up with a Screaming Skull before putting the shade all over the skin. And for this, the paint I'm going to be using is Leviathan Purple in the contrast range. And what we'll be looking for is just getting a nice smooth coat over all the panels, so anything that should be purple, so picking out that, so the carapace on the back here for instance, the sliding scales going down the tail, the sort of armour plating on the kneecaps, and not forgetting the really quite beautiful head crest on the top of the model. Now the other part that is quite easily missed, now some weapons are different, but with this particular model using the death spitter, the top of the weapon here, it has a little bit of armour panelling to it, so not forgetting just to pick out those sort of scales as well, so it sort of broaches down to the side and across. So pop all that on, do take your time. Obviously if you make any mistakes, go back over and clean up with Screaming Skull, and then we can move on to getting that shade over the skin. Once you're happy with that purple and fixed any mistakes, we're going to put the skin shade on, and for that we're going to be using a mix of contrast medium and Magos purple contrast paint. And for this, the mix we're going to be using is a 3:1 ratio of 3 parts contrast medium to 1 part Magos purple. This dilutes it just enough to give a nice subtle purple tone over the top of the model, and what we're going to be doing is just putting a nice even coat all over the model of all the skin parts. You don't have to worry too much about the parts that are going to be red afterwards, but there is obviously no harm in coating them to make sure that obviously all other areas have got it. And you don't want it to pull too much, apart from obviously in the nice sort of recessed areas as to where obviously the skin dives in a bit, but obviously go nice and smooth. When you get to the tail in particular, don't obviously load up your brush too much, but instead just sort of pull towards the tip of the tail, and that way it will give you a nice smooth finish. But otherwise, again, to go all the way round for the lash whip here. The gun itself you don't have to worry too much about. I mean the upper arm and up to this sort of stage here, whereas this a whole other end here, this will be red and a darker recess on these sort of ventral parts here. Again, not worrying about the sword because that is going to be red, but the obviously the arm and hand part there, again coat that. So work your way around the model in terms of everything you want to have the skin shade. Again, don't worry if it does hit the purple, it will dry and you will not even know it is on there. Once you've got that skin shade applied and dry, we're going to move on to filling in a few of the smaller details in the skin. So these little sort of vent areas here, and obviously on the legs, any sort of open flesh patches between the sort of panels and the legs here, and obviously any other sort of open flesh areas around the feet, and again on the arms as well. And for this we're going to be using another mix of contrast medium and this time Volupus pink contrast paint. This is a 1-to-1 mix. It just takes a little bit of the edge out of how dark the pink is, and improves the flow just ever so slightly, and obviously depending on how many models you're doing, you can obviously mix up accordingly, but obviously you want a nice small brush for getting into those details, and just take your time to fill. Most of the time it will drop in very nicely to what you're looking for. And don't worry if you go around the edges just a little bit, you can just use your finger to wipe it away. The quicker you are obviously with that, the better, because obviously it won't have started to dry. That does also help when thinning it down slightly. But just work your way around the model. Obviously get all the bits that you want to be slightly darker in the skin, and then let that dry. It's also worth noting as well that while using this mix, using it to give a little bit more definition to the sort of muscle structure around the mouth. So a lot of these open mouths have these sort of vented parts at the back here, and I tend just to put a nice little coating of this over those just to make it look a bit more like a fleshy mouth. Once you're happy with how those skin vents are looking, we're going to move on to base coating the weapons. For this we're going to be using Flesh Tearers Red from the contrast range, and what we're going to be looking for here is a nice smooth coat over the weapons, claws, and the hoofs of the model. So again, just taking it straight from the pot, carefully work your way around the model, picking out any of those details that you want to be red. If you're a little unsure, obviously other than watching my tutorial, the box art is a good way of determining what should be red and what shouldn't be. And then when it comes to the weapon here, obviously be very careful not to hit the vent that you've already painted in with the Volupus pink, but the weapon itself in red will come to about here, where the sort of purple carapace stops as well, and then the rest of that, as I say, is just a normal shade colour. And then you'd come down and you'll cover sort of all of this clawed area here with contrast red. After you've got that red dry, the next thing we're going to do is just start blocking in a few more details. Now, the way we're going to use a couple of contrast paints in a few different ways. So first of all, we're going for Guilliman Flesh, and this is first of all just straight from the pot. And this is to coat over any sort of bio sort of pipes that are coming out of the guns. So for this one, that goes on the sort of holding arm here, and you don't have to be too heavy with this, but necessarily just enough to coat it, and then you'll get the nice sort of auto highlight that comes with it, which obviously contrast paints are so famous for. So there's that one underneath the gun, and then the model itself also has these little sort of patches under the arms here, on the sword arm here, and then there's also the adrenaline glands, if you choose to use them, adrenal glands on the back, which there is a sort of cobbled effect, and you don't want to do the whole gland, but just the cobbled part in the middle. So do take your time and try not to go over, but if you do, then you can always touch back up with Screaming Skull. But if you coat those details, and then we'll move on to the next stage. Once you've got that Guilliman Flesh applied to those pipes, the next thing we're going to move on to is staying with Guilliman Flesh, but we're going to dilute it down with contrast medium. For this we're going to be doing 3 parts contrast medium to 1 part Guilliman Flesh, so almost a bit like a glaze consistency. And this is actually going to be focused on the lash whip. So what we're going to do is just put a coat all over the lash whip itself, and going all the way down to the red spikes on the very end. But this just gives it a slightly different hue to the rest of the skin, so nothing is too similar, and gives a nice sort of alien weaponry feel to it. So the next detail we're going to block in is on this tongue part. Now each of the mouths that these warriors have is slightly different, so some of them just have a normal sort of tongue that stick out. This one has this sort of lashing sort of spike coming out. And what we're going to do here is go back to Volupus Pink, and this time it really is just straight from the pot, and very carefully just coat this spike part coming down towards, again, the red tip. Try not to get it on the teeth if you can, because again we're going to be coming back to those shortly with another colour. But if you do make any mistakes, then you can always just touch up again with a little bit of Screaming Skull, because again, as I say, we're going to be covering them up. So staying with the lash whip, we're going to use a little bit of Warp Lightning contrast paint, and this is to pick out those little sort of dots on the end of the handle here. Not the easiest to see, but they're slightly embedded. They look a little bit like bug eyes, but what we're going to do is just coat them slightly, and it just breaks up the transition and gives them a bit more of a sort of dangerous alien feel to them. And then again with Warp Lightning, we're going to look at the top part of the lash whip, just there. Next we're going to move on to Skeleton Horde, and this is to pick out the teeth details around the mouth. So again, straight from the pot, just pick out the fronts of the teeth and carefully coat them, trying not to obviously hit the bottom part of the jaw, which is still obviously a flesh colour. Now it doesn't also hurt if you want to sort of get to the back of the mouth as well, just to add a little bit of sort of depth and darkness in there, because obviously their mouths aren't exactly going to be clean and white like the rest of them to some degree. And then moving on to Iodine Yellow, we are going to use this for the eyes, so just literally dropping some into the socket and the sort of immediately sort of surrounding skin just afterwards to try and help with the sort of glowing alien eye effect. Obviously not forgetting the other side. And then also, depending on obviously what weapons you've chosen to use, this particular weapon has an eye sort of on the side here, so we are going to just paint that in there as well. And then to add a little bit of final highlighting to the lash whip and the sort of fleshy part of the tongue, we're going to use a little bit of Pink Horror layer paint, and we're going to just do a sort of edge highlight on the tongue, like so. So just sort of picking out the sharp edge there on both sides, and then very gently down the top. And then on the lash whip, we're going to very delicately coat the spikes on the lash whip with Pink Horror, just again to break up the colour. So do take your time to pick these out, and then we can move on. Once you're happy with how that Pink Horror has gone on, we are then going to move on to highlighting up the skin of the model, and for this we're going to be using Pallid Witch Flesh. This is just quite a sparing edge highlight around the skin, sort of picking out the raised areas of the model. We still want to keep a lot of that sort of purple and pink undertone that we put on earlier on with the shades, and it's really, as I say, just to pick out the high edges, anywhere the light would grab the model. So work your way around, sort of pick out the parts that you feel are good. This is quite an optional stage. If you want the models to look sort of more alieny, more sort of rough and ready, then you can leave the skin as it is. Depending on the size of the bugs, I do actually sometimes do that. The smaller sort of termagant style bugs, I don't put much of a highlight on them, depending on sort of the positions that I have them in, especially with their weapons. Once you're happy with that skin highlight, we can move on to highlighting up the purple carapaces and armour. For this is a 3-stage part, and we're going to use 3 different layer paints to build up a nice sort of gradual feathering effect on the armour. And first of all, we're going to be using Xeros Purple, and how you want to do this is just get a nice fine tip on your brush, not too much paint, but pick an armour panel, any one that you like. They're all sort of the same, and near sort of the base of the panel you want to start sort of drawing so as close as you can, sort of neat sort of lines, so fairly close together, almost touching one another. Obviously the higher and thicker the lines that you go for, the obviously the closer they will become, but you don't have to have them too far apart or close together. For this particular colour, this one is quite dark, so you won't see it as brightly as when we get to the next stages, but it just builds up a nice subtle undertone, and you want to sort of work this around sort of the edges of the model of what we've got, and then we can move on to the next one. But if you work around all of the different armour panellings, and then we can go to stage 2. So the second stage of highlighting up this armour, we're going to move on to Genestealer Purple. And same principle as before, we're looking to draw those neat lines, but this time instead of going quite as high as we did with the Xeros Purple, you're going to stay a little bit closer to the base of the panel that you're working on. But again, obviously try and keep sort of neat lines, so do take your time to pick these out, and then we can move on. And then the final highlight we're going to do is Slanesh Grey. And again, as before, we're just getting ever so greatly smaller with the lines that we're creating, almost as if we are just going over the very, very bottom of the armour. So work your way around and do that. The other thing we're going to use the Slanesh Grey for is to do some sort of edge and raised area highlighting, so for these particular sort of raised nodules on the tail parts here, and then also to pick out the sort of raised crests and creases in the armour. So for example, on the back here there is the centre crease, so again just bring your brush down the centre of that just to pick out that detail, and the same on the head crest here at the top. So next, after you've finished with the Slanesh Grey, we're going to move on to highlighting all the red parts and weapons of the model. This again is a 3-stage process, and first of all we're going to use Evil Sun Scarlet to start us off. And really what we're doing here is again picking out any of the claws, like on the backs of the legs here, and just sort of giving them a bit of an edge highlight. And then with the hoofs, again similar to how we did with the armour, we're going to start at the bottom and just sort of draw some lines going into the top of the hoof. It's not paramount to be the absolute neatest, because again obviously they are hard at work, and we will be adding another highlight afterwards, but you're just sort of bringing it up almost to the top of the hoof, but keeping some of that darker red in tow, ready for when we then get the other highlights in there. And then when you're looking at the swords, for instance, depending on how you've kitted your models out, again just sort of focusing particularly on the edges of the model, but also in the middle of the sword is that sort of raised bump, and again you just sort of want to gently bring your brush down it to catch the top end of the detail. When looking at the guns, obviously they're all a little bit different. This one, for instance, got a little claw on the bottom, so we'll sort of pick out the sort of raised edge on that. But really you're sort of looking at the sort of mouth of the gun, and then sort of any what you would consider ridges. So the contrast really helps pick out those, because obviously it settles on recesses and flat areas quite nicely, but it makes any sort of points and ridges stand out a bit more with the highlighting. So for this one there is quite a clear straight definition going down the top of the gun, and for this I will just pick that out with a slightly brighter colour going to the front of the gun there, making it stand out and catch the light a lot better. So work your way around the model, obviously take your time, and then we'll come back and move on to the next colour. So the next stage of highlighting up the red, we're going to move on to Wild Rider Red. And a bit like when we were using the Genestealer Purple, we are picking out sort of the smaller details that we've obviously already painted in. So on the hoofs, for example, just sort of focusing towards the bottom and sort of bringing the brush just up just ever so slightly to create the feathering effect once again. And then moving, obviously when you're looking at any sort of claws, focusing predominantly on the sort of sharpest points and the sort of curves of the weapon. And again, looking at the swords, this will just be for the sharpest edges that you can see. So again, take your time, work your way around, and once you're happy, we can move on. And then the final highlight to the red, we're going to use Troll Slayer Orange, and this is a very fine edge highlight for picking out the sharpest points and edges of any weapon. So taking the sword, for example, just the top part here, and just very gently the sort of almost like a T-mark shape at the top, just to make it look like the light is catching the top of the model, the sort of middle of the curve there, any sort of tip of the handle. And then with the gun, again, sort of the spike on the bottom, and you could also just run your brush around the mouth of the gun, again catching the best highlight you can. Looking at the hoofs, for example, you can then do a very small feathering effect like you do with the Slaanesh Grey, working your way just round the bottom. So do take your time to pick these out, and then we can move on. And there we have a finished Tyranid warrior in the Hive Fleet Leviathan scheme. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below and I'll be very happy to come back to you. Failing that, if not, I will see you in the next video. Thank you very much.